We are about to begin the as-is residential contract for sale and purchase class. Please listen to this introduction in its entirety. It's going to give you some helpful information prior to entering the class. Please note this is not for CE. This is for informational purposes only. There is no continuing education credit associated with this class. The first thing I want to let you know is in the description below, there is a copy of the most up-to-date contract. Please click on that link and print that version of the contract. Also on that contract, you'll see in red ink some notes that I've inputted for you. This is important information that you should know as you're filling the contract out, something for you to reference back to on a regular basis. So please take the time to do that now. Also, once I start sharing my screen and you see my contract up on the screen, if I have something highlighted, you should probably highlight it also. So take a few minutes to get a highlighter if you don't have that. Also in the description below, I'm going to have the entire contract time-stamped. So if you're only looking for one portion at this moment, if you're looking for an explanation on just one section, feel free to look at the timestamp and fast forward to that part of the contract. Quickly, let's review what makes a legal contract in Florida. It's different from state to state, so it's an important piece to review. There's 4 things that make a legal contract in Florida. The first is meeting of the minds or an understanding of the agreement. In this case, the as-is residential contract for sale and purchase. 2 is mutual assent. Both parties wishing to enter into the contract. 3, consideration. What the consideration is in this instance is a buyer saying, I will pay you X amount for this, and the seller saying, I will sell this to you. And finally, we have capacity, not entering into the contract with a minor, not entering into the contract with somebody who is impaired due to drugs, alcohol, or illness. So those are the 4 things that make a legal contract here in Florida. Before you begin writing a contract for the first time, when you're sitting down with your buyers, it's important to contact the listing agent. Let them know that your buyers have viewed the home, that you're sitting down to prepare a contract. You can ask the listing agent if there's any other offers on the table. You can also ask the listing agent if there's some kind of special consideration the sellers are looking for. Perhaps they're looking for a quick close, or perhaps they need a little bit more time. This is excellent information to have as you approach your negotiation. Also ask the listing agent, when is the first possible time that they'll be able to sit down and meet with the seller? You don't want to put your time for acceptance in 2 hours from now if the listing agent lets you know that the sellers are currently on a cruise in the Bahamas and it'll take at least 24 hours to get a response. This would also be a great time to ask the listing agent, if they have not already listed it in the MLS, who is going to pay for title. If the listing agent has already had that conversation with the sellers and they're looking to use ABC title, also use ABC title as the escrow agent on the contract. If the listing agent indicates that that's a negotiated item within the contract, which it is, then you're just going to put whoever's going to hold the escrow for you on the contract. The money can always be transferred later to the closing agency. Also, prior to filling out the contract, you should reach out to the mortgage professional. This is an important step. In Section 8 of the contract, we're writing in what our loan approval period is. The default is 30 days. Sometimes, if buyers have already been through the underwriting process, they may only need 15 or 20 days to close a contract. Other times, buyers are starting at the very beginning and the mortgage professional might need 30 or 45 days. To save you the step of having to write an extension and perhaps the seller saying, we're not interested in extending this loan approval period and canceling the contract on you, you want to make sure you're building enough time in for your customer. So call the mortgage professional early and find out what that time period is. Maybe tack a couple of extra days on. So if they say we can get it done in 45 days, maybe put 47 or 48 days. Also important to have a calendar in front of you while you're filling out this contract, so you're not putting any of these important dates like the closing date on a Saturday, Sunday, or national legal holiday. Okay, let's jump right into the as-is residential contract for sale and purchase. Ideally, you've listened to the entire introduction for this video, the as-is residential contract for sale and purchase. If you have not, please go back and do so now, as things will make much more sense if you do. If you already have, let's dive in. As you'll notice, each line of the contract is numbered. Some of the lines have an asterisk next to the number, and some do not. If there is an asterisk next to the number, this is a place you're going to either fill something in or make a choice. We never leave anything blank on the contract. We are always going to fill something in or make a choice. The very first thing I'd like to talk about are the parties to the contract. The parties to the contract are the seller or sellers and the buyer or buyers. It is never anyone else. The only 2 people or only parties that can make decisions based on the contract are the sellers or the buyers. Customarily, we have one or maybe two sellers and or buyers. If there are more, that's okay. Just write as many sellers and or buyers on the line provided. Line 3 goes on to say, agree that the seller shall sell and the buyer shall buy the following described real property and personal property, collectively property, pursuant to the terms and conditions of the as-is residential contract for sale and purchase and any riders and addenda, meaning contract. This means that any rider or addenda you attach to this contract becomes part of the whole contract. Section number 1, we're going to talk about the property description. We're going to enter the street address, the number, and the street name, as well as the city and the zip code. Second, we're going to put what county the property is located in, as well as the property tax ID. You can gain the property tax ID either from the county property appraiser site or Realist from your MLS dashboard. Item 1C asks for the legal description of the property, and ideally you're going to get that from the latest survey. Oftentimes people take the legal description from the property appraiser site. This is not best practice as it may have been entered incorrectly. Ensure when you are entering the legal description, you're using the long legal description and not the short. The real property, together with the existing improvements and fixtures, including built-in appliances, built-in furnishings, and attached wall-to-wall carpeting and flooring, real property, unless specifically excluded in paragraph 1E or by other terms of the contract. Other terms of the contract will always mean an addendum. So if at some point in time something within this contract changes and an addendum is drafted in writing and is signed by both the seller and the buyer, that is other terms of the contract. So let's talk about personal property, item 1D. Personal property, unless excluded in paragraph 1E or by other terms of the contract, the following items which are owned by the seller and existing on the property as of the date of the initial offer are included in the purchase. Ranges, ovens, refrigerators, dishwashers, disposal, ceiling fans, light fixtures, drapery rods and draperies, blinds, window treatments, smoke detectors, garage door openers, thermostats, doorbells, television wall mounts and television mounting hardware, security gate and other access devices, mailbox keys and storm shutters, storm protection items and hardware, collectively personal property. You'll notice some of these items have an S after it in parentheses. This may mean there might be more than one range or one refrigerator on the property. If the seller intends, for example, to convey the refrigerator in the kitchen, but not the refrigerator that's housed in the garage refrigerator must be specified on line 1E in exclusion from the purchase. You can write the serial number down of the refrigerator that's in the garage so there's no confusion as to which one stays and which one goes, or take a picture of the excluded item and add that to an addendum as an exclusion. If you're the listing agent, it's important for you to walk room by room with your sellers and talk about each item that is expected to convey and ask them if it is something they want to leave with the home or if it is something to be excluded. For example, certain light fixtures might have a special sentimental value, or perhaps the window treatments or the draperies or blinds match the comforter of the bedding and the homeowners want to take them with them. Just be sure to have the conversation up front. If there are items to be excluded in the contract, write it in the realtor remarks in the MLS listing. When you receive the contract, make sure you're checking to ensure the excluded items are listed. You'll see on line 21, there's an opportunity for other personal property items to be included in the purchase. I've written there other items that commonly convey, and you may want to have the conversation with the seller and the buyer. They include the washer, the dryer, the microwave, and pool equipment. Of course, anything can be included here, and anything can be excluded on line 1E as long as the buyer and the seller agree. Please take special note of line 23. It says personal property is included in the purchase price and has no contributory value and shall be left for the buyer. At times, we may try and include things on line 21 and 22, such as furniture in the second bedroom or lawnmower, and this might raise a red flag for your mortgage person. So be sure to have that conversation early if there are larger items or groups of items that are going to be left or conveyed with the property, that the verbiage is going to comply with whatever the mortgage professional needs. Now let's take a look at number 2, purchase price. Please take note that every single line is accounted for. We have written something in on every single line. We're not leaving anything blank. And also note that whatever we're doing on lines 27 through 41 have to add up to line 42. So let's take a look. The purchase price in US currency. We're going to assume that the purchase price is $100,000. The initial deposit to be held in escrow in the amount of, in this case, we're going to offer $10,000, but it can be anything that the buyer and seller agree to. The initial deposit to be made payable and deliverable to the escrow agent named below, and then we're going to check one, either accompanies the offer or is to be made within, if left blank, 3 days. Your broker will let you know whether or not he wishes the escrow deposits to accompany the offer. If they leave that decision up to you, I would suggest you choose box 2 is to be made within, if left blank, 3 days after the effective date. This is a good dry run for somebody to work with a title company and wiring their deposit before they have to make any larger deposits later down the road closer to closing. It also alleviates you from having to touch other people's money, which could lead to issues down the road if the laws are not followed very specifically. The default here is 3 days, but don't be afraid to add more time to that if you feel like it's necessary. For example, if it's Friday and your buyer is leaving tomorrow, Saturday, to drive back to Illinois, and Monday is a national legal holiday, 3 days might not be enough time for them to get the deposit in. So you can extend that again to 5 days or 7 days or whatever the buyer and seller agree to. Now, the escrow agent information must be filled out, and I've provided here for you the Florida Administrative Code that dictates that has to happen. So it's Rule 61J2-14.0082B of the Florida Administrative Code, and it's Florida Statute 407.05 of Florida statutes that gives the power of the commission to enact bylaws and rules. The rule they're enacting is the one that we mentioned first, and that dictates that the escrow information must be provided to have a valid contract. Item 2B talks about additional deposits to be delivered to the escrow agent within whatever time period the seller and buyer agree to. If there is no second deposit, we're going to put a 0 on the line. For financing, we're going to express that as a dollar amount or a percentage. Here we have a dollar amount of $80,000. If you're doing this in Transaction Desk, Form Simplicity, App Files, or another system your broker has provided for you, as you fill these numbers in, they will automatically provide the number for you on line 42. Line 40 asks for other. This may be a third deposit. We don't typically see that, but sometimes in luxury real estate, it is something that happens. So you'll just put a 0 on line 40 as well if there's no additional deposit. Line 41 says a balance to include, not including the buyer's closing costs, prepaids, and prorations by wire transfer or other collected funds. And here we have our amount of $10,000. If we started with $100,000 and we deducted $10,000 for the deposit, that leaves $90,000. If the buyers are going to finance $80,000, we subtract that from the $90,000, and that gives us the $10,000 they need to bring to closing, not including their closing costs, prepaids, and prorations. Never accept the word balance on line 42. It's ambiguous, and we don't want to leave anything up to question with our buyers or our sellers. We want everyone to have a clear picture of what the transaction is going to be. Now we're going to take it number 3, time for acceptance of the offer and counteroffer and the effective date. If not signed by the buyer and seller and an executed copy delivered to all parties on or before whatever the date is, this offer shall be deemed withdrawn and the deposit, if any, shall be returned to the buyer. Unless otherwise stated, time for acceptance of any counteroffer shall be 2 days after the day the counteroffer is delivered. Before we look at the standard O to determine what delivered means, you should have already had a conversation with the listing agent, and you're going to put a reasonable time frame in for the acceptance. For example, if it's Tuesday at 10 a.m. and you're writing this offer, a time for acceptance of Tuesday at 11:30 a.m. might not be a reasonable time frame for the listing agent to get with the sellers, or the sellers may be at work or doing other things. Be sure to have that conversation and give your buyers the best opportunity by giving them a reasonable acceptance time. We've already talked about the standards being the rules of the contract, and we're going to go now to look at Standard O on page 10. So we can scroll through to page 10. We're going to find Standard O, Contract Not Recordable, Persons Bound, Notice Delivery Copies, Contract Execution. And we've highlighted this portion here. Notice and delivery given by or to the attorney or broker, including such broker's real estate licensee, representing any party, shall be as effective as given by or to that party. That means when the contract hits your inbox, your email inbox, it is considered delivered to your customer. So when we're talking about the delivered date or an effective date, it is the last date that somebody has signed, initialed, and delivered back to the agent. Item 3B, the effective date of the contract shall be the date when the last one of the buyer seller has signed or initialed and delivered this offer or final counteroffer. The effective date never changes. For example, if this contract hits your inbox in your email on Tuesday at 11:58 p.m., that is the effective date. Next, we're going to talk about the closing and the closing date, number 4. It says the closing of this transaction shall occur when the funds required for closing are received by the closing agent and collected pursuant to Standard S, and all closing documents required to be furnished by each party pursuant to the contract and delivered. Unless modified by other provisions of this contract, the closing shall occur on, or you'll notice I wrote the words or before on the line, at the time established by the closing agent. If, for example, the closing date is March 7th, and we have the words on or before on the line, and everyone is in agreement and can close on March 5th, then you can go ahead and do that. Everyone is obligated to close on the 7th, but if you can close on the 5th, you will do that. If you don't have the words or before on that line, you'll have to type up an addendum and have everyone sign it, which is not a big deal. This just saves you that step. Please look at the very last part of this sentence, at the time established by the closing agent. It's important that you schedule your closing early so you get the time of day your customer wants to close. So have that conversation with your customer early, call the closing agent early, and request that specific time period be put on the books for them. Moving on to item 5, extension of the closing date. In the event closing funds from the buyer's lender are not available on the closing date due to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau closing disclosure requirements, the CFPB requirements, if paragraph 8B is checked, meaning it's a finance transaction, loan approval has been obtained and the lender's underwriting is complete, the closing date shall be extended for such period necessary to satisfy the CFPB requirements, provided such period shall not exceed 7 days. Remember that disclosure period is 3 business days prior to the loan closing, so that disclosure must be provided to the buyers 3 business days prior to the loan closing. Whether you have the buyer or the seller in the transaction, you're contacting the mortgage person to ensure that disclosure has been sent out. In an event constituting force majeure causes services essential for closing to be unavailable, including the unavailability of utilities or issuance of hazard, wind, flood, or homeowners insurance, the closing date shall be extended as provided in Standard G. Let's go to page 9 and take a look at Standard G. And it tells us right here, it talks about the definition for force majeure. Means hurricanes, flood, extreme weather, earthquakes, fires, or other acts of God, unusual transportation delays, wars, insurrections, civil unrest, or acts of terrorism, governmental actions and mandates, governmental shutdowns, epidemics, or pandemics. And we're just going to skip down here. All time periods affected by force majeure event, including the closing date, will be extended a reasonable time, up to 7 days after the force majeure event no longer prevents performance under this contract. Provided, however, if such force majeure event continues to prevent performance under the contract more than 30 days beyond the closing date, then either party may terminate this contract by delivering written notice to the other, and the deposit shall be refunded to the buyer, thereby releasing the buyer and seller from further obligation under this contract. Hurricane Ian made us realize that this part of the contract does not give us absolute concrete information. It talks about the force majeure event will be deemed to have begun on the first day the effect of the force majeure prevents performance, non-performance, or availability of services. When we have an event such as a hurricane, it's hard to determine what the first day is, when non-performance started, when availability of services. One person might have received electric and internet services long before somebody else did. So what we found during instances like that is it really is up to the buyer and the seller working through their agents to come up with how they're going to proceed. So if people are at a total loss, we start here with what's in the standard, but we know that we have some flexibility in here because if the buyer and the seller agree to something else, they absolutely can do that. If they agree that they're going to go 45 days past the closing date, they absolutely can do that. We're just going to make sure we put everything in writing and everybody is going to sign everything. But this is our starting point and our guide as to where we should go. Taking a look at occupancy and possession. So unless paragraph 6B is checked, the seller shall at closing deliver occupancy and possession of the property to the buyer free of tenants and occupants and further tenancies. Also, at closing, the seller shall have removed all personal items and trash from the property and shall deliver all keys, garage door openers, and access devices and codes as applicable to the buyer. If occupancy is to be delivered before closing, the buyer assumes all risk of loss to the property from the date of occupancy, shall be responsible and liable for maintenance from that date, and shall have accepted the property in its existing condition as of the time of taking occupancy. A couple of things I want to point out here. The sentence that begins on line 66, also at closing, and extends through line 68 to buyer. We're going to re-reference this after we read paragraph 12, item B. So we're going to come back to that in just a couple of minutes. The part I want us to focus on right now is on line 68. It says, if occupancy is to be delivered before closing. So we're right here. The buyer assumes all risk of loss to the property as of that date. If the buyer is going to occupy the property, ensure that they contact their insurance agent and make sure the insurance company is aware of that so they can have the proper insurance in place in the event that there's a fire or an accident or something happens. That way your buyer is fully insured. Also, this means that they're accepting the property in the existing condition as of the time of taking occupancy. So if the seller was supposed to complete certain tasks on the property and the buyer takes occupancy prior to closing, the buyer is in essence just accepting the condition and the seller is really released from those tasks. So make sure that you write a new addendum if the buyer is going to preoccupy the home. If certain things are still needed to be done, that you say in that addendum, even though we're preoccupying the home, the seller is still going to do X, Y, and Z. Item 6B. We're going to check this if the property is subject to lease or occupancy after closing. That means there's an existing lease or we have a lease for something that's going to happen soon after closing. The facts and terms thereof shall be disclosed in writing by the seller to the buyer, and copies of the written leases shall be delivered to the buyer all within 5 days after the effective date. Now, at times you may have a buyer who's insisting on having the lease ahead of time before they make a deal. And the seller might say, no way, I'm not doing that. It's important that the buyer understands what the seller's obligation is per the contract. Of course, we can certainly ask the seller, but it doesn't mean they have to provide the lease information. Conversely, a seller might not want to release the lease information until closer to closing because they want to make sure they have a serious buyer. They've likely hired an attorney to draft those leases, paid a lot of money, and they don't want somebody poaching that information. So the seller has to be aware of their obligation of providing that 5 days after the effective date. Moving down to assignability, we're going to check 1. The buyer may assign and thereby be released from further liability under this contract. This is likely an investor who, for example, may think he can purchase this property under this contract for $100,000 and resell the contract before it closes for an additional $20,000, giving himself a profit of $20,000. This does happen. It is legal. It's written within the contract, but it is not the norm. So if somebody does check that first box, I would have a conversation with your broker for some guidance. Option 2, the buyer may assign but not be released from liability under the contract. Likely, the buyer will want to assign this contract to an LLC or a family trust that they may not have set up yet, and this gives them the opportunity to do that. Option C, may not assign this contract. Nothing to do there. They're liable for the contract and nothing else is happening. Okay, so we're going to get into financing. Paragraph 8, there's a lot to unpack here. So if option A is checked, this is a cash transaction with no finance contingency. We want to make sure we get proof of funds, and that's going to come from a bank or a portfolio statement. If you receive those proof of funds and the buyer's agent for some reason did not redact certain personal information like addresses or account numbers, be sure to do that yourself before you put it in your file or send it off to your seller. Let's take a look at option B. So if 8B is checked, the contract is contingent upon within, if left blank 30 days after the effective date, the loan approval period. Two things have to happen within the loan approval period. So we want to make sure both of these things happen. If you watch the introduction, I know that you would already have contacted the mortgage person and you have a very clear idea of how much time needs to have happen before they can close this transaction. So it may be 30 days, it may be 15, it may be 45 or 60 days. Whatever that time period is, we're going to put on that line. So the first thing that has to happen is the buyer has to obtain approval. So number 1 on line 90 says the buyer obtaining approval of A, and we're going to check one. The reason we're going to make sure we check a box for what type of loan, what type of interest rate, and an interest rate not to exceed is because this is an added protection for our buyer. If our buyer only wants to purchase the home with a conventional mortgage and we don't check anything here, and the mortgage company says, well, you don't qualify for conventional, but you do qualify for FHA, the buyer is still obligated to move forward with this transaction. So this is an added protection for our buyer, and we're going to make sure we fill this out completely. So the buyer obtaining approval of, you're going to choose conventional, FHA, VA, or other. Other may be a USDA loan, or it may be a physician's loan. There's all sorts of different loans out there available to people. For the purchase price of the property, 4A, fixed, adjustable, or fixed or adjustable rate in the loan amount, see paragraph 2C, at the initial interest rate not to exceed whatever that's going to be, if left blank, the prevailing rate based on the buyer's creditworthiness. Let's assume that interest rates are right around 7% today, and the buyer says to you, well, I don't want to exceed 7.5%. Thinking they have excellent credit, they move forward without filling this out. So they don't indicate what their top interest rate would be. And the mortgage person says, congratulations, you qualify for a loan at 9% interest. Well, if nothing is filled out here, then the buyer is obligated to proceed. If 7.5% interest is indicated on line 92, then that buyer has a right to say, I need to walk away from this contract. It does not meet the contractual terms. And for a term of, if left blank, 30 years. Could be 15 years, 30 years. So that is number 1. The buyer has to be approved for the loan. Number 2, the property has to be approved. So the buyer's mortgage broker or lender, having received an appraisal or alternative valuation of the property satisfactory to the lender, if either is required by the lender, which is sufficient to meet the terms required for the lender to provide financing for the buyer and proceed to closing. So a couple of things here. An alternative valuation, maybe a broker price opinion, something along those lines. So it's something, whatever the bank determines they need to determine what the value of that property is. Someone has a very large portfolio, they have a lot of money, they're putting a lot of money down on a property, a broker price opinion might be enough to satisfy that lender. It used to be the appraisal would happen toward the very end of a transaction, almost a week or so before closing. It's important for your buyers to understand that's happening much sooner now because both of these things have to happen, the buyer approval and the property approval, within that loan approval period. So those are happening much sooner. So just prepare your buyers for that. Item 8B1, we're here now. The buyer shall make application for financing within, if left blank, 5 days after the effective date. I can't stress this enough. Once you have an executed contract, you're going to send it to the title company or the attorney, whoever's going to close the transaction. You're also going to send it to the mortgage professional so they can get to work on the transaction. You're going to follow up with both your customer and the mortgage person within those 5 days or whatever the time period is that was specified to ensure that they have communicated and are working toward the loan. Now, we know that mortgage professionals also work on commission and they're anxious to get things moving as well. So generally, when you send a contract to them, they immediately call the customer to get things rolling. Let's take a look at line 100. It says loan approval, which requires the buyer to sell other property, shall not be considered loan approval unless Rider V is attached. And Rider V is the sale of the buyer's property. And we're going to travel to page 12 real quick here. Page 11. And you can see we have sale of buyer's property highlighted. That box would have to be clicked, and that addendum would have to be attached to this contract. Okay, this is a big one. Line 102 through line 105. Buyer's failure to use good faith and diligent effort to obtain loan approval during the loan approval period shall be considered a default under the terms of the contract. For purposes of this provision, diligent effort includes, but is not limited to, timely furnishing all documents and information required by the buyer's mortgage broker and lender, and paying for appraisal and other fees and charges in connection with the buyer's application for financing. It's important to keep in mind that the mortgage process has changed in recent years, and it has become much more stringent, and some of your buyers might not be used to that. And so you really want to set the expectation and let them know that it's maybe a more difficult process. They'll be providing much more information than they may have had to provide in the past. And it would be a good idea for them to keep any information that they've sent to the mortgage person or the underwriter handy, because they may have to send it again. Expectations are everything. If you set them up to know that this is going to be a longer process than it has been in the past, they might be able to receive it a little bit better than they would if they didn't have that information. I often get the question when we're doing a contract class, if it's okay, if I'm the buyer's agent or if I'm the seller's agent, let's say I'm the listing agent, is it okay for me to contact the mortgage person or the title company? And yes, it absolutely is okay. Make sure that you have this area here highlighted starting on line 108. The buyer authorizes the buyer's mortgage broker, lender, and closing agent to disclose such status and progress and release preliminary and finally executed closing documents and settlement statements as appropriate and allowed to the seller and broker. So if you're the listing agent, it would be important to call the mortgage professional early, introduce yourself, and set the rapport. So that way, as the transaction goes along and you're calling for updates, those conversations go much more smoothly. Looking at line 111, if within the loan approval period, the buyer obtains loan approval, the buyer shall notify the seller of same in writing prior to the expiration of the loan approval period. Or if the buyer is unable to obtain loan approval within the loan approval period, but the buyer is satisfied with the buyer's ability to obtain loan approval and proceed to closing, the buyer shall deliver written notice to the seller confirming same prior to the expiration of the loan approval period. Oftentimes, the mortgage company is going to send an email, it's usually balloons or confetti involved, that says, congratulations, you've obtained loan approval. And they often send that to the agent as well. So once you receive that email, that's what you're going to pass on to the listing agent. But remember, you're tracking the dates to ensure you do receive loan approval within the loan approval period. Get an extension if it's not going to happen within that period. But once you receive that email, you're going to send that along because you have to provide that in writing. Line 115, if the buyer is unable to obtain loan approval within the loan approval period and cannot timely meet the terms of the loan approval, after the exercise of good faith and diligent effort, the buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice of the termination to the seller prior to the expiration of the loan approval period, whereupon, provided the buyer is not in default under the terms of the contract, the buyer shall be refunded the deposit, thereby releasing the buyer and seller from all further obligation under the contract. So according to this contract, you do not need a letter from the lender stating the person could not get loan approval. You just need notice from the buyer, written notice from the buyer. Line 120. If the buyer fails to timely deliver any written notice provided for in paragraph 8B3 or Fore, Roman numerals got me, above to the seller prior to the expiration of the loan approval period, then the buyer shall proceed forward with the contract as though paragraph 8A above has been checked as of the effective date, provided, however, the seller may elect to terminate this contract by delivering written notice of termination to the buyer within 3 days after the expiration of the loan approval period. And provided the buyer is not in default under the terms of the contract, the buyer shall be refunded the deposit, thereby releasing the buyer and seller from all further obligations under the contract. So assuming the buyer received loan approval or the buyer is confident in their ability to close the loan, and they have not given that notice to the seller in writing, 3 days after the expiration of the loan approval period, the seller can cancel the contract. The buyer will get their deposit back, but keep in mind the seller may have a better offer on the table, and they can do that according to this contract. So do you want to tell your buyers who are very close to closing that because we didn't forward an email or take care of our dates, we lost out on a house and here's your deposit back? It's imperative that you track the dates. If buyer has timely provided either written notice provided for in paragraph 8B3 above, and the buyer thereafter fails to close the contract, the deposit shall be paid to the seller unless failure to close is due to 1, a seller's default or inability to satisfy other contingencies of this contract, or 2, property-related conditions of the loan approval, specifically excluding the appraisal valuation, have not been met unless such conditions are waived by other provisions of the contract, in which event the buyer shall be refunded a deposit, thereby releasing the buyer and seller from further obligation under this contract. If lines 132 or 133 are checked, I would suggest you see your broker, as again, this is not something that we often see, and you want to make sure that you are guiding your customers in the best way possible. Talks about the assumption of an existing mortgage or a purchase money note and mortgage to the seller, which basically means seller financing. Let's take a look at closing costs, fees, and charges, number 9. A couple of things that we want to highlight. On line 140, we see other, and on line 154, we see other. You want to double check these lines to make sure nothing has been written there. Oftentimes, or sometimes, one of the agents may write in closing costs to be paid by the other customer. Say they have the seller, they might write on line 154 for some kind of administrative fee to be paid by the buyer. So you just want to make sure that your customers are aware of what they're obligating themselves to. The highlighted portion, lines 142 to 145, we're going to come back to in just a few minutes. For title, evidence, and insurance, if left blank, then 15, or if paragraph 8A is checked, which means it's cash, then 5 days prior to closing, the title evidence is due. So ensure that you're tracking those dates so the title work is coming in when it is supposed to. Line 159, if the seller has an owner's policy of title insurance covering the real property, the seller shall furnish a copy to the buyer and the closing agent within 5 days after the effective date. We can typically count on our title company or our attorney's office calling the seller and asking them for that, but we should really do our due diligence as a listing agent and ask our sellers for that information. This goes along with a survey as well. Oftentimes they won't know what title policy is or where that might be. Ask them for the big envelope they received when they closed on the house. Typically they know where that is. It's stored in a closet somewhere. Ask them if you can retrieve that with them. Look through for the information you know you'll need, the title policy and the survey. Have that readily available for the title company and the buyer. Line 162, the title insurance premium charges for the owner's policy and any lender's policy will be calculated and allocated in accordance with Florida law. So those insurance premiums are set by the state. Every title company, every closing agent, attorney's office, or title company charges the same insurance premium. What their charges are to process that paperwork might vary, but the premium themselves is set by the state and does not change. So line 168, we have an option to make here. We're either going to choose line 168 or line 172. So 168 begins with the seller shall designate the closing agent and pay the owner's policy and charges, and the buyer shall pay the premium for the buyer's lender's policy and charges for closing services related to the lender's policy, endorsements, and loan closing, which amounts shall be paid by the buyer to the closing agent or such other provided as the buyer may select. Or the buyer shall designate the closing agent and pay the owner's policy and charges for closing services related to the buyer's lender's policy, endorsements, and loan closing. We don't have to worry about the Miami-Dade Broward provision because we're not doing business in that area. This is for our board here or our association here. So customarily in Charlotte County, the seller pays title, and we're used to seeing line 168 checked off, but this is a negotiated item within the contract. So either 168 or 172 is acceptable. It's whatever the buyer and seller agree to, okay? It's really important that you remember there are two policies being issued. One is the owner's policy and the other is the lender's policy. According to the contract, the buyer always pays for the lender's policy and any other charges that go along with that. The only policy that we're negotiating here is the owner's policy. That could be paid by the seller, choose line 178, or by the buyer, choose line 172. Whoever is paying for the owner's policy chooses the closing agent. Moving down to the survey, at least 5 days prior to the closing date, the buyer may, at the buyer's expense, have a real property surveyed and certified by a registered Florida surveyor. If the seller has a survey covering the real property, a copy shall be furnished to the buyer and the closing agent within 5 days of the effective date. Remember, we just talked about that big envelope. If there is a survey, it's going to be in there. Now, if the survey is outdated, meaning it is a survey of vacant land and now there's a house on the property, or there's a survey of a home and a fence and a pool has been added, that's okay. We're still going to provide the survey for the next surveyor to work off of. Talking about the home warranty, at closing, the buyer, the seller, or nobody shall pay for a home warranty plan issued by, you must include the company name here, at the cost not to exceed, and we're going to put an exact dollar amount. So you want to call your home warranty company, find out exactly the amount you're going to need for that home warranty and put that on the line. I know it says not to exceed, but the more specific we are in these contracts, the better off we are. Obviously, anyone can purchase a home warranty outside of the contract. This is just if one party is going to purchase within the contract. Talking about special assessments, at closing, the seller shall pay the full amount of liens imposed by a public body. Public bodies do not include condominium or homeowners associations that are certified, confirmed, and ratified before closing, and the amount of the public body's most recent estimate or assessment of an improvement which is sustainably complete as of the effective date, but has not resulted in a lien being imposed on the property before closing. The buyer shall pay all other assessments. If special assessments may be paid in installments, either the seller shall pay installments due prior to closing, and the buyer shall pay installments due after closing. Installments prepaid or due for the year of closing shall be prorated. Or the seller shall pay in full prior to or at the time of closing any assessment allowed by a public body to be prepaid. For any assessment which a public body does not allow prepayment, option A shall be deemed selected for such assessments. So if you remember back to pre-licensing, we always had that example of the roadway was going to be paved and each homeowner was going to be assessed for half of the roadway, right? So whatever the linear footage of your property times however much that was going to be, that's what they're talking about here with the special assessments. Please take special care in speaking with your customers about what option is going to be selected and what option is going to be accepted. Line 200, this paragraph 9F should not apply to special benefit tax lien imposed by a community development district pursuant to Chapter 190 of the Florida statute, or special assessments opposed to a special district pursuant to Chapter 189 of the Florida statute. What liens or assessments shall be prorated pursuant to Standard K. So if you look up Chapter 190 or 189, it talks about what other those special assessments may mean, and that might be security for a community or lake maintenance for community lakes, those types of things. But you can just Google those Florida statutes for more information. We're going to jump into disclosures and talk about parts of these. When we're looking at radon gas, if we look at line 206, what's highlighted, levels of radon that exceed federal and state guidelines have been found in buildings in Florida. Radon gas is naturally occurring in Florida, and also it comes down from building materials that are being brought to Florida from the north. I've heard agents say time and again, there is no radon in Florida. That is not true. Looking at permit disclosures, line 212. If the seller identifies permits which have been closed or improvements which were not permitted, the seller shall promptly deliver to the buyer all plans, written documentation, or other information in the seller's possession, knowledge, or control relating to improvements to the property, which are subject to such open permits or unpermitted improvements. It's important to note the seller is not obligated to outlay any money. You'll see paragraph 12, item C. We'll take a look at that when we get a little bit closer to there. So basically, the seller has to give all information they have, but they're not obligated to expend any money. Looking at the flood zone and elevation certificate, beginning on line 220. If a property is in a special flood hazard area or Coastal Barrier Resource Act designated area, or otherwise protected area identified under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under the Coastal Barrier Resource Act at the lowest flood elevation of the building and or flood insurance rating purposes is below minimum flood elevation or is ineligible for flood insurance coverage through the National Flood Insurance Program or private flood insurance as defined in 42 U.S. Constitution 4012A, the buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice to the seller within, if left blank, 20 days after the effective date, and the buyer shall be refunded the deposit, thereby releasing the buyer and seller from further obligation under this contract. Failing which, the buyer accepts existing elevation of the building and the flood zone designated of the property. I read through that entire section because I don't want it to be confused with Rider H, which sets limits for an acceptable insurance premium. So this is saying if a property is located in a special flood hazard area or a Coastal Barrier Resource Act designated area, and the buyer cannot get flood insurance, they can cancel the contract according to the days set from the effective date. Rider H sets a limit on the acceptable insurance premium for flood insurance. So say a buyer says, well, I'm going to purchase this house in a flood zone. If I can get my flood insurance at an annual premium of $3,000, that's great, but I'm not willing to exceed that. So if they can only get a quote for $4,000 a year, they can cancel the premium with that addendum. Okay, a few things to talk about here, and I'm glad the energy brochure and the lead paint brochure are kind of right next to each other. The buyer acknowledges receipt of the Florida Energy Efficiency Rating Information brochure required by Section 553.996 of the Florida statute. And then we have the lead paint. If the property includes pre-1978 residential housing, a lead paint disclosure is mandatory. Your buyers also have to receive the Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home brochure. And we have to attach, obviously, the lead paint rider. What I would encourage you to do is make both of these items a part of your buyer packet, something that you're going to email to your buyers with other information that's pertinent to them. That way you have record that you did indeed give them that information, or make it a habit to put into your buyer folders so that way they're receiving that information immediately. Item G, your homeowners association community disclosure. The buyer should not execute this contract until the buyer has received and read the homeowners association and community disclosure if applicable. That is what the contract says. I know in practice, because we have this inspection period built into this contract, a lot of people overlook that. So if you look at the top here in the margin, I've just made a note for you because there tends to be a lot of confusion on this. If the property is located in a homeowners association, the HOA disclosure must be attached. So if you're the listing agent, you should be attaching this to your MLS listing. The HOA disclosure is a 2-page form. It identifies fees and any special assessments that the seller is paying currently, and the contact information for the management company. It is the buyer's responsibility to obtain the most up-to-date forms from an HOA. That's why you're provided with the contact information. So some of our buyers, that's an easy thing for them to do. And for some of our buyers, that might be a bit overwhelming. So if you have to sit on your phone on speaker with your buyer next to you and call the contact information and request that information be emailed, generally that is free. If you request the information to be printed, there may be a fee associated with that. Taking a look for a condo writer, it is the seller's responsibility to provide at the seller's expense the documents listed on the condo writer. So make sure you're clear on that. In an HOA, it's the buyer's responsibility to gain those documents. And if it's a condo, it's the seller's responsibility to provide at their expense the documents listed on the condo writer. Looking at the property tax disclosure summary in all caps here, item H, starting on line 236. The buyer should not rely on the seller's current property tax as the amount of the property taxes that the buyer may be obligated to pay in the year subsequent to the purchase. A change of ownership or property improvements triggers reassessments of the property that could result in higher property taxes. If you have any questions concerning valuation, contact the county property appraiser office for information. Remember, we cannot be all things to all people, but we are the source of sources. So if your customer has any questions on what the property tax may be, it says right in the contract what you're to do is to guide them toward the county property appraiser office. So ensure you do that. Okay, looking at foreign investment and real property tax. The seller shall inform the buyer in writing if the seller is a foreign person as defined by the Foreign Investment Real Property Tax Act. So we're going to look at that a little bit closer when we get to standard V. Towards the back of the contract, there is an addendum there's a FERPTA addendum. So we're just going to make sure that we attach that to the contract. Let's talk about the seller disclosure. This says the seller knows of no facts materially affecting the value of real property, which are not readily observable and which have not been disclosed to the buyer. Except as provided for in the preceding sentence, the seller extends and intends no warranty, makes no representation of any type, either express or implied, as to the physical condition or history of the property. Except as otherwise disclosed in writing, the seller has received no written or verbal notice from any government entity or agency as to a currently uncorrected building, environmental, or safety code violation. So my question to you is, how does the seller know what is or isn't a material defect? While the property disclosure is not required by Florida law, I would highly encourage you to use the property disclosure as a protection for the seller, for the buyer, and for yourself. I'll share a quick story with you on when a property disclosure saved the day on one of my transactions. I had the buyer, and when we were going to write the contract for the property, there was no property disclosure attached to the MLS. I called the listing agent and requested the property disclosure, and he said the seller was not going to give one as he never occupied the property. It was a rental property. I had talked to my buyers about the importance of a property disclosure, and we made the contract contingent upon the seller providing the disclosure. So the listing agent and I went back and forth a little bit because the seller did not want to provide one, but ultimately he did. And so we moved towards the transaction. After closing, we know that the recorded deed is sent to the water company to change the name to the new owner of the property. When that happened, the city contacted the new owners and said, what are you going to do about the leak on the property? And what are you going to do about the back water bills? So, of course, the buyers immediately called me, and I was totally freaked out, honestly. And I said, let me gather my paperwork and I'll give you a call right back. And so I looked in the file and I looked over the property disclosure thinking, did I miss something? And no, I did not. The seller had never mentioned anything about any leaks. So I called the buyer back and I said, I have the property disclosure. The seller never mentioned anything about a leak. And they said, well, the water company got in touch with us. They sent us all the email conversations they've had with the seller. So we have that documentation. So I said, well, I'm going to be right over. So I brought them a copy of the property disclosure. I brought them a copy of the contract, and I brought them 2 business cards of local attorneys. I said, I'm very sorry this has happened. This is how I would suggest you proceed contacting an attorney for legal advice. Ultimately, the issue was resolved between the seller and the buyers, which I'm very grateful for. But I will say, if this went to a courtroom and they looked at me as a realtor and they looked at the listing agent as a realtor, they would have asked us, did you use skill, care, and diligence? Did anybody know about this leak? And all the seller would have had to say is, I told my agent. And if that agent said, well, I told the buyer's agent and she chose not to tell them, I can about guarantee it would have been me and the listing agent paying for those water bills and repairs. So it's imperative that you get these property disclosures for everybody's protection. If you're sitting at a listing table and somebody does not want to fill it out, you should probably walk away from that listing. You can make the contract contingent upon a property disclosure. There is an addendum available to you for that. If the seller refuses to provide one and the buyers say, we're okay with that, I would send your buyers an email stressing the importance of the property disclosure, respecting their decision, and move forward if that's what you and your broker are comfortable with. But again, it's just a good protection for everybody involved. Okay, off my soapbox. Moving on to property maintenance. Except for ordinary wear and tear and casualty loss, the seller shall maintain the property, including but not limited to the lawn, shrubbery, and pool in the condition existing as of the effective date, known as the as-is maintenance requirement. See paragraph 9A for escrow procedures if applicable. So we're going to travel back to page 3. So this is if you show up for the walkthrough and the manicured lawn is now up to your knees and the blue pool is now a black pool, this is what we're going to do. Starting on line 142. If prior to closing, the seller is unable to meet the as-is maintenance requirement as required by paragraph 11, a sum equal to 125% of the estimated cost to meet the as-is maintenance requirement shall be escrowed at closing. If the actual cost to meet the as-is maintenance requirement exceeds the escrowed amount, the seller shall pay such actual cost. Any unused portion of the escrowed amount shall be returned to the seller. So yes, it'll be a huge hassle because now you're going to run around and try and get an estimate of repair for the pool and an estimate for the lawn and bring those to the title company so the seller can see them so that he can then escrow 125% of the estimated costs. But issues like these come up all the time during walkthroughs, and oftentimes people come up with, I'm air quoting here, very interesting solutions. All of your answers are in the contract, so just know where to look to find them. All right, taking a look at property inspection, right to cancel. The buyer shall have, if left blank 15 days after the effective date, known as the inspection period, within which to have such inspections of the property performed as the buyer shall desire during the inspection period. If the buyer determines at the buyer's sole discretion that the property is not acceptable to the buyer may terminate the contract by delivering written notice of such election to the seller prior to the expiration of the inspection period. When it says the buyer's sole discretion, the buyer does not even have to have an inspection done. They can just decide for any reason, I don't want to move forward with this, put it in writing, and get their deposit back if they've put a deposit down already. If the buyer timely terminates this contract, the deposit is paid, shall be returned to the buyer. Thereupon, the buyer and seller shall be released from further obligation under this contract. However, the buyer shall be responsible for prompt payment of such inspections for repairs of damage to and restoration of the property resulting from such inspection, and shall provide the seller with the paid receipts and all work done on the property. The preceding provisions shall survive termination of the contract. So we may have been at some kind of home inspection and the home inspector is using this really cool monitoring device to determine if there's any moisture in the walls. And let's say, for example, they find moisture, in the wall near the kitchen faucet. And the buyer says, well, we need to rip the wall open to see if there's any damage to the pipes in there. So that is being accounted for here. Obviously, we're going to let the seller know what's going on there, but the buyer would be responsible for putting the property exactly back to how it was prior to the inspection. Unless the buyer exercises the right to terminate granted herein, the buyer accepts the physical condition of the property and any violation of governmental, building, environmental, and safety codes, restrictions, or requirements, but subject to seller continuing the as-is maintenance requirement, and the buyer shall be responsible for any and all repairs and improvements required by the buyer's lender. It's imperative you put everything in writing in a timely manner. If you are unable to get all of your inspections completed, or come to a determination as to what the seller is going to do and what the buyer is going to accept within the inspection period, then you need to try and extend that inspection period. If the seller is not willing to extend the inspection period, then the buyer may want to terminate the contract. Whatever conversations you're in the middle of, whatever text messages you're in the middle of, whatever emails you're having back and forth between the two agents, they don't count for anything. Whatever is going to happen within this time period has to be put in writing and signed by the buyers and or sellers. All right, speaking of the walkthrough inspection, the walkthrough inspection is solely to confirm that all items of personal property are on the property and to verify the seller has maintained the property as required by the as-is maintenance requirement and has met all other contractual obligations. So let's go back to page 2. And I said we were going to come back to this portion here. So we're under 6A. Also at closing, the seller shall have removed all personal items and trash from the property and shall deliver all keys, garage door openers, access devices, and codes, if applicable, to the buyer. So a couple of different scenarios that may happen here. You go for the walkthrough and some furniture items that were supposed to not be there are currently there. Well, according to the contract, item 6A, those items have to be removed by the seller. Okay, looking at the seller's assistance and cooperating with closeout and building permits, we touched on this briefly when we were talking about item 10B. The seller shall not be required to expend or become obligated to expend any money. That doesn't mean they ultimately won't, but they're not obligated to do so. All right, item 13, escrow agent and broker. So speaking of the escrow agent, line 296, failure of funds to become collected shall not excuse the buyer's performance. When conflicting demands for a deposit are received or an agent has good faith doubt as to the entitlement of the deposit, it talks about what they should do. It is imperative if you are an agent and there's some kind of dispute over the deposit, you must contact your broker immediately, especially if the broker is holding that deposit in their own escrow account. They have a whole set of things that they have to do according to Florida law. So they have to be aware that there's some kind of dispute going on. So do not hesitate to contact your broker immediately. Okay, professional advice and broker liability. In all caps here, it says the buyer agrees to rely solely on the seller, professional inspectors, and governmental agencies for verification of property conditions, square footage, and facts that materially affect the property value, and not on the representation, oral, written, or otherwise, of the broker. It goes on to say that the broker is not going to be held liable for anybody that they refer, if they say something wrong, that type of thing. But I do want you to keep in mind here, starting on line 332, this paragraph 14 will not relieve the broker of statutory obligations under Chapter 475 of the Florida statute as amended. For purposes of this paragraph 14, the broker will be treated as a party of this contract. This paragraph 14 shall survive closing and termination of the contract. So here's what I want to say. This is not your get out of jail free card. Okay. As a single agent or transaction broker, we owe our customers or clients the duty of skill, care, and diligence. If we have a no brokerage relationship with our customers or clients, it is a deal honestly and fairly obligation. So in either way, if something goes terribly wrong with this and FREC determines that somebody had a misstep and did not use skill, care, and diligence, or did not deal honestly or fairly with their customer, they're going to refer back to those items. Those are the statutory obligations that they're speaking about. Okay, moving on to dispute resolution. If the buyer defaults, if the buyer fails, neglects, or refuses to perform the buyer's obligations under this contract, including payment of the deposit within the time specified, the seller may elect to recover and retain the deposit for the account of the seller as agreed upon liquidated damages, consideration for execution of this contract, and in full settlement of any claims, whereupon the buyer and seller shall be relieved from all further obligation under the contract, or the seller at the seller's option may, pursuant to paragraph 16, provide in equity to enforce the seller's rights under the contract. The portion of the deposit, if any, paid to the listing broker upon default by the buyer shall be split equally between the listing and the cooperating broker, provided, however, the cooperating broker's share shall not be greater than the commission amount the listing broker had agreed to pay to the cooperating broker. Keep in mind, when you're signing a listing agreement with a seller, there's a portion in that contract that dictates if the buyer defaults, a part of that commission is going to go to the listing broker, and the listing broker is going to pay a part of that commission to the cooperating broker. Now let's talk about the seller default. If for any reason other than the failure of the seller to make the seller's title marketable after reasonable diligent effort, the seller fails, neglects, or refuses to perform the seller's obligation under the contract, the buyer may elect to receive return of the buyer's deposit without thereby waiving any action for damage resulting from the seller's breach, and pursuant to paragraph 16, may seek to recover such damages or seek specific performance. So damages may mean I have an 18-wheeler full of furniture that I'm paying for, I have nowhere to live, and I'm going to be living in a hotel room for the next 3 weeks. That may be damages. Okay, item 16, dispute resolution. Unresolved controversies, claims, and other matters in question between the buyer and the seller arising out of or relating to this contract or its breach, enforcement, or interpretation will be settled as follows. Now, if you get to this point, you have some kind of dispute going on and you have not contacted your broker, you should be doing that immediately. So as soon as there is some dispute, you want to get your broker involved right away. The buyer and seller will have 10 days after the date of conflicting demands for the deposit are made to attempt to resolve such dispute, failing which the buyer and seller shall submit such dispute to mediation under paragraph 16B. Item B, the buyer and seller shall attempt to settle dispute in an amicable manner through the mediation pursuant to Florida rules for certified and court-appointed mediators and Chapter 44 of the Florida statute. The mediator must be certified or must be experienced in the real estate industry. Injunctive relief may be sought without first complying with paragraph 16B. Disputes not settled pursuant to this paragraph 16 may be resolved by instituting action in an appropriate court having jurisdiction in the matter. This paragraph 16 shall survive closing and termination of the contract. Keep in mind, if your deposit is $5,000 or less than $5,000, this can go to small claims court. The first thing that happens in a small claims court transaction is it goes to mediation before it actually goes to court. So you are in accordance with the law. So if the deposit is under $5,000 and there's a dispute, that would be your first mode. 17, attorney's fees and costs. The parties will split equally any mediation fee incurred in any mediation permitted by this contract, and each party will pay their own costs, expenses, and fees, including attorney's fees incurred in the conducting of the mediation. In any litigation permitted by this contract, the prevailing party shall be entitled to recover from the non-prevailing party costs and fees, including reasonable attorney's fees incurred in conducting the litigation. This paragraph 17 shall survive closing and termination of the contract. All right, so we know the standards are the rules of the contract. We have that nice and large right there. So within the standards, there's a couple of things I want to point out, some areas that we have not talked about yet. The first one is item D, lease information. The seller shall, at least 10 days prior to closing, furnish to the buyer estoppel letters from tenants or occupants specifying the nature and duration of occupancy, rental rates, advanced rent, and security deposit paid by the tenants or occupants. This is known as estoppel letters. Item E, liens. The seller shall furnish to the buyer at closing an affidavit attesting to the absence of any financing statement, claims, or lien or potential lieners known to the seller, and that there have been no improvements or repairs to the real property for 90 days immediately preceding the closing date. This is something that the closing officer is going to provide. It's just a form that they're going to sign stating that neither of these things have happened. This section F, lines 432 through 438, may be one of the most important sections of this contract and something that you should really spend time getting to know. I encourage you to, make a copy of this, cut it out, put it on your bulletin board above your desk, so you're very aware of it and it's ever present in your mind. So let's take a look. This is the time clause. Time is of the essence in this contract. Calendar days based on where the property is located shall be used in computing time periods. Other than time for acceptance and effective date as set forth in paragraph 3, any time periods provided for or dates specified in this contract, whether pre-printed, handwritten, typewritten, or inserted herein, which shall end or occur on a Saturday, Sunday, national legal public holiday, as defined in 5 U.S. Constitution, section 6103A, or a day on which a national legal public holiday is observed because it fell on a Saturday or Sunday, shall extend to the next calendar day, which is not a Saturday, Sunday, national legal public holiday, or a day on which a national legal public holiday is observed. Let's say, for example, your inspection period ends on Sunday. Really, it ends on Monday. If Monday is a national legal public holiday, say it's Labor Day, then your inspection period would technically end on Tuesday. So it's important to have this information in front of you so you're aware of that. When you're writing your contract, it's also a good idea to have a calendar in front of you so you're not landing on Saturday, Sundays, or national legal public holidays, just to avoid any confusion with anyone. Now, as far as what those national legal holidays are, I would also encourage you to look at the U.S. Constitution, section 6103A. You can just Google that, and then the legal public holidays will be brought up on the screen for you. Let's talk about the location of your closing. The closing will be conducted by the attorney or the closing agent designated by the party paying for the owner's policy of the title insurance, and will take place in the county where the real property is located at the office of the closing agent or at such other location agreed to by the parties. This is really important to remember for a couple of reasons. One, you may have a buyer or a seller who does not want to travel outside of county lines because they're just not comfortable traveling that far away. We should know that in the contract it says that they have to close within the county they live in. The other thing I want you to keep in mind here, if a closing agent is planning on sending a mobile notary to close the transaction, be really clear on what the documents are that are being sent. Because if it's imperative that that transaction closes that day and a mobile notary is sent, nothing can change in that transaction that day. So if there's something wrong with those documents, the title company has to rework the documents and resend them out to the mobile notary. So it's likely you won't close the day that you're supposed to. So be very aware of that and make sure your customers are aware of it. Let's talk about risk of loss. So this is another paragraph that we spent a lot of time with just recently after Hurricane Ian. If after the effective date but before closing the property is damaged by fire or other casualty, and cost restoration, which shall include cost of pruning and removing damaged trees, does not exceed 1.5% of the purchase price, cost of restoration shall be the obligation of the seller, and closing shall proceed pursuant to the terms of the contract. If restoration is not completed as of closing, a sum equal to 125% of the estimated cost to complete restoration, not to exceed 1.5% of the purchase price, will be escrowed at closing. If the actual cost of restoration exceeds the escrowed amount, the seller shall pay such actual cost, but not to exceed 1.5% of the purchase price. Any unused portion of the escrowed amount shall be returned to the seller. If the cost of restoration exceeds 1.5% of the purchase price, the buyer shall elect to either take the property as is together with the 1.5%, or receive a refund of the deposit, thereby releasing the buyer and seller from further obligation under the contract. Seller's sole obligation with respect to tree damage and casualty or other natural occurrence shall be the cost of pruning or removal. So again, it's wonderful that we have this standard within the contract, and it gives us a starting point and an excellent guide. The piece that we ran into some trouble with after this last hurricane was getting the estimate for repair, because there was so much damage and so many people were displaced. It took a long time for some of us to get those estimates. So it's something that the buyer and seller will have to work through and come to terms with the assistance of their agents. Okay, a 1031 exchange, that is simply a tax instrument. You're going to seek professional advice on that. We do offer a 1031 exchange class every quarter here at the association. It's a virtual class, so you can sign up for it on the event calendar and get more information about that. Okay, integration and modification. This is a big one. No modification to or change in this contract shall be valid or binding upon the buyer or seller unless in writing and executed by the parties intended to be bound by it. So again, we were talking about this during the inspection period. Everything must be in writing and signed by the buyer and seller. If it is not in writing and not signed by the buyer and seller, it does not exist. Also keep in mind here, riders, addenda, and typewritten or handwritten provisions shall control all pre-printed provisions of this contract in conflict with them. So any change that you make through a rider, an addendum, or anything that you handwrite on this contract is going to supersede what is typewritten. If there is some kind of conflict, we're looking here at item U, the contract shall be construed in accordance with the laws of the state of Florida, and the venue for resolution of all disputes, whether mediation, arbitration, or litigation, shall lie in the county where the real property is located. So it talks about FERPTA here on item V, and I have some information for you down in the margin. So let's just take a look at that, and then we'll come back up to number 19. So here are some notes on FERPTA. It's an enforcement mechanism to ensure taxes are paid. Foreign persons do not pay more than anyone else. Their taxes are simply being collected and held up front. When they file a tax return, if they paid too much, they will be given a refund just like anyone else. You want to contact your title company or attorney early to let them refer the buyer or seller to a tax professional. The title company holds the withheld money up to 90 days before sending it to the IRS. For more information, you can visit FERPTAsolutions.com. All right, so let's come back here to number 19. And this is talking about the addenda. The following additional terms are included and attached addenda or riders and incorporated into this contract. Check all that are applicable. So you'll just check the ones that are applicable to the contract you're working on. If it's in a condominium, you're going to click that. If it's a homeowners association, you'll check that. Seller financing, mortgage assumption, FHA, VA, whatever the case may be. Again, we have the seller buyer, the sale of the buyer's property that was highlighted just for previous reference. As far as additional terms, you'll want to see your broker before you write anything in additional terms or before accepting anything that is written here. Again, we don't want anything to be ambiguous or unclear, especially if there's a dispute in the contract and a good amount of time goes by. What you wrote there at one point in time or what you told your customers was okay to accept might not be clear 12 or 18 months down the road. So be very careful with what you accept in additional terms. And then we have the box where you can check the seller counters the buyer's offer. This is intended to be a legally binding contract. If not fully understood, seek the advice of an attorney. Okay, so everyone can sign and initial this contract, and we can check this box and attach the counteroffer form. That's one way to do it. We can just call and have a conversation, mark up the contract, or write what we call a clean contract, and have everybody sign that. So there's more than one way to do it. Talk to your broker. It's really at their discretion how they want you to proceed that way. And then the buyer and or buyers and seller and or sellers are going to sign. Again, if there's more than two buyers, you're just going to find room, have them sign it and date it. I know there's only 2 lines for each. It stresses me out too, but that's fine. That's what it is. And we also know at the bottom of every page, there's a spot for the buyer's initials and seller's initials. And just because there's 2 lines doesn't mean we can't have more than 2 buyers or sellers. So that is it for the as-is residential contract for sale and purchase. If you have any questions on this, please feel free to reach out to me. I am always available to talk to you more about it.